following program on Other Derana 24 is classified MA. It is intended for adults and may be unsuitable for children under 17. It may contain crude, indecent language, explicit sexual activity, graphic violence, or political ideology. Viewer discretion is strictly advised. The following program contains opinions of the participants and does not reflect the views and beliefs of the Derana Media Network. The network believes in a safe space for all ideas to be expressed without any censorship and on its duty to create such a platform for free speech. Viewer discretion is strictly advised.
The Geneva game of cat and mouse. And so it begins again. Sri Lanka is back in Geneva for the 52nd session of the UN Human Rights Council, but this time, since we are the obedient servant of the US, we may get a free chance to fly by. Unfortunately, this free chance will only be limited until we continue to toe the line at the West and further ensure we weaken our state by adopting everything they say. To make sense of this and other matters concerning our nation, tonight I will speak to Distinguished Research Fellow at University College London, Professor Steve Keen, State Minister of Foreign Affairs Tharaka Balasuriya, the President of the Society for Peace, Unity and Human Rights Organisation in Australia, Dr. Dasarath Jayasuriya, Professor and Research Fellow of the International Centre for Interdisciplinary Research in Law at Laurentian University, Canada, Professor Neville Hevage, and Sri Lankan Ambassador to the People's Republic of China, Dr. Palitha Kohoda. Good evening, I'm Mahesh Johnny, and this is the State of the Nation. And a very good evening to all. As always, appreciate your company. We have a lot to get through tonight, so let's get right to it. Ever notice how the most important stories get the least amount of coverage in the media these days? It is alarming to see that trend. Now, we have wall-to-wall coverage on matters that should be focused on the least, like holding the local government election. Why do we need it? Because the JVP and the SJB think that they can win. So naturally, for them, it's essential. And they are telling you and me that we should care as well. Uphold democracy, they say. Don't touch the rights of the people to vote, they say. But the biggest story that is getting the least amount of attention and is not discussed, sought after, or even recognized by the mainstream media is the story we all need to focus on. Unfortunately, it's happening right under our noses. And thanks to our politicians, it's been swept under the rug once again, just as it has been done for more than 75 years. Right now, our leaders are praying to the IMF gods to come out of this economic crisis, which most of them put us there. The gods are somewhat answering. They don't want to answer our prayers just yet because they need to milk more out of our miserable situation and tie us further towards a vagabond state. Is anyone asking what will happen once we get the bailout package? Is it going to create better conditions for you and me? Will the inflation go down? Can we afford essential goods at a bearable price? Will the unfair taxes be fixed? The reality of that, sadly, it would not. But there is one thing the IMF bailout will guarantee: access to money markets. What does that mean? It means more borrowing. The government, be it this one or anyone for that matter, will once again be able to borrow as they please. Why? Because the IMF is guaranteeing the creditors to go ahead and give more money to this country. And our debt, currently hovering around $60 billion, will double, triple, and quadruple. Wait, what was that line the Liberals used to say during the unrest last year? Oh yes, we've become a nation of borrowers, borrowed so much, and now we are paying the price. If only we could exchange liberal minds for dollars, then at least We have more dollars and less of the liberal nonsense. It's true that for us to stay afloat at this moment, we may have to borrow. That is a fact. But that borrowing should create new money, be reinvested, not be added to the expenses of this country. Right now, our leaders only have a one-trick pony as a solution, the IMF. They are religiously following a cult mentality. A few years back, when these very same proposals were implemented and affected us in the negatory, the SLPP, the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, was dead against it and rose to the occasion to be the voice of the people. It only took 3 years, and they are also now chanting praises of the very organization they detested. Isn't this what a cult is? See, right now, our leaders need to be inspiring us to find solutions to this problem through mechanisms of our own. It is not groundbreaking stuff we need to do in order to escape of this crisis. It's pretty simple. If it's a dollar crisis, we must find ways to sell our products overseas in order to find that dollars. If we don't have enough investments, we must increase middle-income investments via our local entrepreneurs. If we don't have the goods we need, then we have to push ourselves to manufacture them here rather than looking to import them. Honestly, in our governing structure, we don't have leaders. All that we have is a bunch of selfish morons. For 75 years, they have managed to fool each and every one of us, and they have lived a lavish life. Isn't it our time to live that lavish life? If that's the case, we can't apply the same theories and strategies we used in the past 75 years that got us to this point. So we have to start thinking afresh. I will be right back. Welcome back, everyone. This is the State of the Nation. Now, the United Nations Human Rights Council, the organization known as the Cesspool of Bias, is beginning its 52nd session tomorrow in Geneva, Switzerland. So naturally, we as Sri Lankans would expect them to take Sri Lanka as a crucial discussion point. But to our surprise, we couldn't find anything Sri Lanka related in the current agenda. Now, it's still a draft agenda and it can change any moment, even as we speak. Now, despite our nation not being in the draft agenda, this doesn't mean Sri Lanka's resolution and progress would not be taken up. Surely it would be mentioned in the High Commissioner's report to the Council, and also, so far we might think that it will be taken up at the preliminary session of the Council. Now, but the absence of Sri Lanka being discussed extensively sheds a light on another story that needs to be told in the mainstream media. Why are we getting a free pass this time around? Is it because we are now obedient supporters of the United States? And is it because we are very much implementing their needs and wants? Sadly, I have to keep mentioning the past continuously. But there was a similar situation back in 2015 where we were given a pass by the UNHRC because at that time too, the American investment, which was the good governance, just came to power, and the UNHRC said that we have to give them time to work things out. But no such luck to former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's government. In the first year, back in 2019 itself, despite being amidst a COVID pandemic, the heavily biased Michelle Bachelet was up in arms against that administration. Obviously, we know why. In case Sri Lanka is taken up, what will they discuss this time around? Joining me now from the data board is Danidu Thanamasam. Danidu, good to see you once again. I know you have been looking at the past resolutions and trying to understand exactly what we have to deliver this time around. I think the previous resolution was in somewhere around in 2022.
Yeah. So much just to clarify that 2022, there was an update with regards to the Human Rights Commissioner who gave an update on 46/1, which is the most latest one, which I'll be looking at momentarily. What we need to understand is, Mahesh, the focus of the 2022 update was primarily on the entire regime changing initiative that went on in our country, and you have really covered this extensively. Not sure how that really relates to the human rights situation back in during the war against the LTTE. Now, four particular items that we see in the 16 operative clauses that have been mentioned within 46/1. One is the militarization, which I will spend some time on. Second, the erosion of the judiciary. These are terms that have been used within that within the document itself. Then the prosecution of human rights related crimes, they call it some special forms of cases that need to be taken up initially, and the protection of civil society actors. Now, the latter two, which you can understand very clearly, is something that is requested almost in a general basis. But we see that the militarization was an aspect that was vehemently criticized both by 46/1 and by the High Commissioner's update, which you were referring to in 2022, which was in October of 2022. This mentioned that about 28 appointments were made. We are not sure how these things are relevant to the mandate of the UNHRC, but we believe that these are also things that will be taken up this time session, because we see that things like the Chief of Staff, which is General Shavendra Silva, or even other security appointments have not been changed by the current administration. So definitely we are expecting this to be taken up again.
It's funny that we have to talk about the mandate of the UNHRC, whereas apparently, in organizations, when you join, you usually the the Human Resources Department, the HR department comes and gives you a little bit of a refresher saying this is our mandate, this is what we do. Perhaps I think they failed to do that in the UNHRC. Maybe it's due. Anyhow, as always, Danidithanavasam at the data board. Thank you very much. Now, the UNHRC is trying to determine whether human rights violations occurred in Sri Lanka's final phase of the war. However, this organization has a track record where certain groups can get into their system and lobby hard. Basically, they believe them for life. In Sri Lanka's case, yet the UNHRC has not determined whether war crimes occurred. They, however, wanted to punish the Rajapaksas, mainly President Mahinda Rajapaksa. Now, as things are, thanks to last year's JVP-supported unrest, they managed to get rid of them. And Canada led the way in imposing the first rounds of sanctions. Sri Lanka is not the only nation that has been mistreated this way. If you look at the case of Israel, they get slapped, I think, the most number of resolutions from the UNHRC. But Israel has never given two hoots about that body, not because they are correct, but because they're purely biased. Even in Sri Lanka's case, the UNHRC is more worried about how many terrorists were killed. But when it comes to the 5,000 army soldiers from Sri Lanka whose status is still unknown, UNHRC becomes deaf, blind, and mute. Even the human rights jokers in Sri Lanka too can't be bothered to speak about that, as they are too busy talking about the rights of disruptors, or better yet, misdirecting your attention to the hatred they created against this country. Let's get some idea as to what the UNHRC might be up to this time around. Joining me now is the president of the Society for Peace, Unity and Human Rights Organization in Australia, Dr. Dasarat Jayasuriya. He's in Sri Lanka at the moment, and I got the opportunity to speak to him. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your time. Now, with Sri Lanka toeing the line of America and the West and putting their needs first, it might be seen that there might not be an adverse resolution passed in the UNHRC this time around. But learning from past experiences, whenever there was a similar situation, like back in the good governance days, Sri Lanka became a sponsor of the resolution 30-1, which allowed foreign judges to interfere in Sri Lankan process. So what is your reading on this time situation?
That's a very good question, Mahesh. It reminds me of a few words that were spoken by the Trojan priest of Poseidon, Lycaon, who basically said that don't trust the horse and don't have faith in the people who bear gifts, because I don't trust the Greek. In this case, the Greeks have to be replaced by the Americans. And there's no point in compromising like what we've done in the past. We should stand on principles. I think there are 5 points that I would like to quickly go through. One is the illegality of the whole process that has gone through, because the UN resolution in the General Assembly talks about these universal periodic reviews as the mechanism for investigations such as these, and that any such reviews has to be done in collaboration. Unfortunately, we have been marked to have an individual investigation as a country, and that is reserved for places like in Ukraine, when there are major violations of human rights, and they have used this as a tool to beat up Sri Lanka. And the second point is that the Ban Ki-moon report, the YSL, is also a personal report that had been commissioned by the then the head of the Human Rights Commission, and then subsequently the erroneous data that the 40,000 people died, when they have very strong evidence to say that there was only 8,136 people who died. Global Sri Lanka Forum has done a very deep research into that, and we can see that that's the status. The third point is that when you look at the resolution that was passed in 2015, there has been a mechanism that has been set up to investigate Sri Lankans and collate and archive the data so that they can go on a subsequent time and have some prosecutions against individuals. And I think that is not the right thing to do. And of course, in the last resolution that was in 2020, there were issues with expanding the scope into economic crimes, and I think that is a terrible extension of the jurisdiction by the Human Rights Commission.
Indeed, Doctor. Now, whatever is said and done, we really need to and be really honest in finding a solution to the reconciliation process in order to address the real concerns of our fellow Tamil community. Now, in your opinion, what is the best way that we can address that?
I think that is a fallacy to say that it's only the Tamils that have issues in Sri Lanka. All Sri Lankans, irrespective of any ethnic community, whether it's the Tamil, Sinhalese, Muslim, Burgher, or whatever, Malays, we all have issues. And those issues have to be addressed as Sri Lankans. There are 3 or 4 issues that our Tamil politicians use and raise to keep the separatist agenda alive. One is the so-called homeland concept, which has been debunked by many historians. I like to also point out to the thesis of Kadiresu Murugeswaran, who's actually, his thesis talks about the kingdom in Jaffna, the Sri Lankan kings, Sinhala kings ruling Jaffna. And then also this discriminatory issue is a fallacy as well, because the discrimination, when you think about, it happens everywhere at every level. The law is not applied uniformly to the people, so that itself is a discrimination. The third point is the aspirations of Tamils. I think the aspirations should be for all Sri Lankans. We as Sri Lankans, bereft of any ethnicity, or whether it is Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims, Malays, we all have aspirations, and all those aspirations have to be listened to by government and start working towards achieving those aspirations. Unfortunately, the Tamil politicians have converted this into a Tamil issue, as if these issues are only relevant to the Tamil people. And when you look at the application of the language, and it is actually the Sinhalese who have been discriminated, because except for the 7 districts where Sinhalese has been given as the language of administration, in the north and the east, Tamil is used as the administration languages, and we can't even go to a court and present our case in Sinhalese or even in English.
Indeed, understood, Doctor. Now, the Sri Lankan government has been very lethargic and ineffective when it comes to fighting the propaganda of the LTTE. How can that be addressed, in your opinion?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to develop a national policy. It was Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia, who said that national security is integral to economic prosperity. And when the separatist agenda, although militarily defeated, is in a covert way being prosecuted by the Tamil diaspora, who's still remnants of the LTTE, not all diaspora I should say, but the LTTE diaspora, and also the Tamil politicians who are prosecuting separatism, we need to confront that by having a uniform policy that spans across all political divide. And we, as overseas Sri Lankans who are promoting national unity, territorial integrity, and the sovereignty of Sri Lanka, will always collaborate with that. The second point is that we should set up a desk for expatriates to focus on this issue and work on it, because the recent shenanigans that happened in Toronto, in Canada, where a council unilaterally declared a genocidal week, things like issues like that, we need to be proactive and deal with it in a much more comprehensive and a collaborative way with people living overseas, the Canadian Sri Lankans who are pro Sri Lanka. The third point that I would like to say is that we should repeal any laws that is leading towards separatism like the 13th Amendment, because as long as that goes on, there is always the pushing the boundaries towards more and more independence. All of these accusations can be rebutted against our Sri Lankan soldiers and the UN resolutions by using the two documents that have been produced by the Global Sri Lanka Forum, which is the rebuttal document against the accusations. Then there are two volumes that have been published, and all the information are available, and we would like to collaborate and participate and support the Sri Lanka government as expatriate Sri Lankans as per Global Sri Lanka Forum, and also the expatriate Sri Lankan Federation of Sri Lankan Communities.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much. We had to leave it at that. That was the president of the Society for Peace, Unity and Human Rights Organization in Australia, Dr. Dasarath Jayasuriya. Well, Canada is another culprit that is battering Sri Lanka by only listening to the LTTE propaganda. At least in the UNHRC, there's some fairness in voicing our concerns, but not in Canada. The sadder your storytelling ability is, the better your chances of fooling them. So obviously, the Canadian government has fallen for the utter bull and the Academy Award-winning sob story foretold by the LTTE propaganda arm in Canada, and has imposed sanctions on two former presidents of our country. So what will they be up to this time around? Joining me now is Professor and Research Fellow of the International Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Law at the Laurentian University, Canada, Professor Neville Havegate. Good to see you once again, Professor. Thank you for joining me. He joins me now via Zoom from Toronto, Canada. Professor, I wanted to ask you with regard to this UNHRC session this time around, the 52nd one. Even though no proper agenda item is mentioned in the UNHRC on Sri Lanka, we still need to find out what countries like Canada are planning behind the scenes. Since Sri Lanka is an obedient child of the US, we might get a pass this time around. What do you think the Canadian government is cooking up based on the propaganda by the LTTE?
Thank you very much, Mahesh, to invite me for this interview. So this question, I need to start from the beginning. And what is the UNHRC role? UNHRC role is an advisory role, and they cannot implement any punitive measures. And that recommendation, they can implement with the consent. Now we need to find out who are the people behind this core group, resolution against the Sri Lanka. Core group is consists with the mainly from United States and Canada and UK. Pretty much there is a more power on the Western Bloc. Now we need to find out why Western Bloc is more concerned and interested about in Sri Lanka like a small country. And we have 21 million, we don't have oil. So we don't have economic, any resources. Why they are so important? And Western Bloc wants to get ready in the Pacific region, military ready against some other threat. Specifically, they are referring, according to our research work, and against the China. So now, because of they want to against the military readiness, and they need to influence the Sri Lankan government and other parties to get their things done. Actually, now what is happened, now we need to find out what is the LTT role here. LTT role is mainly coming with their propaganda campaign. And their propaganda campaign is mainly accountability and accountability measures. And so in that case, they want to force the other parties in Canada and other parties to get some action against the Sri Lanka. So by doing this one, they are using human rights mechanism as a tool, political tool, to force the Sri Lanka to get military readiness for their campaign. That's what the Canada's plan, and that's what the Western ideology plan. Western group is trying to achieve that one. They are not really interested about the Tamil issue in Sri Lanka. Ultimate goal is to military readiness program in the Indo-Pacific region. That's what the Canada is planning and the behind. But in order to achieve that, they are putting accountability measures and pressurizing the country to get into that part.
Understood. Now, Professor, in Canada, what do you think the LTT propaganda arm hopes to achieve after having succeeded in fooling the people of the state of Ontario? What are they up to now?
But actually, but I do not agree with they are fooling the people in Ontario. It is a very LTT propaganda that created the different kind of phase to people to show what's happening with in Sri Lanka. Completely different thing. But the people understand that Canadian government also not recognize Sri Lanka what they are complaining, and they understood that as a they send us a they send a diplomatic note and referring Sri Lanka issue as a civil conflict or armed conflict. And then by the same time, and military readiness program is there, and that is also leaked cable from US Embassy, and it is also there. Now LTT want to achieve their propaganda. First propaganda campaign is that Tamils are innocent victim of the government of Sri Lanka. And second campaign is for their campaign, second element of their campaign, Sri Lankan Tamils subject to constant discrimination and military oppression. So by adding all those things and what they are going to do, and they want to establish and they want to precedent say that Sri Lanka is no best place to live in Tamils Tamils. By propaganda purpose, and they want to get more refugees to the Western countries. Refugee business is behind this all the scandals. And one of the refugee coming to Canada paid 35,000 getting into the boat. And once they landed here, they had to pay another $35,000 for the LTT operatives here. So main idea is that to influence the asylum policy in Canada to get more refugees to Canada. In that case, they can build up their revenue. So it's a business. It's a completely business, refugee business. That's what they want. They are going to achieve. And these individuals has no whatsoever is concerned about Sri Lankan Tamils. And they want to establish Sri Lanka is an unstable country, no good for the Tamil. Then bring the whatever things Tamil refugees to Canada and make their money. So that's a propaganda campaign, and that is the money-making machine. And Minister of the Foreign Affairs, Melanie Joly, and she knows very well about those things. I have a reasonable ground to believe she knows, but she also playing the political game to get and satisfy the Tamil diaspora's, voter base. So that's what is happening in Canada.
Absolutely. Education is the only way that we can keep these people informed about the real situation. Well, thank you. That was the Professor and Research Fellow of the International Centre for Interdisciplinary Research in Law at the Laurentian University, Canada, Professor Neville Hevige. Appreciate your time. Now, before we take a short commercial break, I want to know what the government hopes to do this time around. For that, I spoke to the State Minister of Foreign Affairs, Tharaka Balasuriya. Watch.
There will be an oral update pertaining to Sri Lanka, pertaining to the human rights, the reconciliation, and the economic crisis, which was all stated in the and economic crimes also, which was all stated in the 51st session. But as far as the overall the Human Rights Council is concerned, the government has been taking very many policies in the right direction. After the new president came into power, the 21st Amendment was passed. Then prior to that, even we had made some amendments to the Prevention of Terrorism Act. We will hopefully bring a new bill before the end of first quarter, and also there's other efforts pertaining to reconciliation. The President has had an all-party conference which deals with the question of power devolution, and also the Foreign Ministry, together with the Presidential Secretariat, is formulating Overseas Sri Lankan's office. We have already hired a Director General, and also there are other steps such as establishing of Overseas Sri Lankan's office, which will initially come under the Presidential Secretariat, but later on under the Foreign Ministry. But as far as the overall strategy is concerned, I think the strategy can be divided into three areas. One is we need to really reach out to the diaspora, the Sri Lankans out over there. There's a misunderstanding of what's actually happening. There's almost a myth that the Sri Lankans in Sri Lanka, that the Sri Lankans are not living together. It's almost portrayed as that everybody is killing one another. There are certain measures which we need to do in order to, of course, build reconciliation, and we need to work on those things, including devolution. But certainly, I think we need to reach out to the diaspora, so the diaspora pressure on other governments would be minimized.
Well, that was the State Minister of Foreign Affairs, Taraka Balasuri, explaining as to what the Sri Lankan government hopes to do at the UNHRC this time around. Now, we're going to take a short commercial break. This is the State of the Nation. Back in a moment. Welcome back, everyone. This is the State of the Nation. Now, Sri Lanka was affected quite severely by a virus not visible to the naked eye. I think 2 years in a row, the infamous coronavirus. It spread worldwide with no discrimination of caste, creed, nationality, ethnicity, living standard, or even geographical location. But there is another virus that has been spreading very covertly. It's not visible to the naked eye, at least first, but its symptoms are quite fatal. This virus, however, primarily affects developing countries such as Sri Lanka. Don't worry, it's not health related. Actually, it's worse. The virus is known as neoliberal economics. One of the institutions promoting this school of thought is the IMF, and the loyal slaves of the IMF in Sri Lanka, aka the Colombo liberals, took the baton and ran with it. Whatever they say flies by them, very, very blindly. Naturally, I cannot turn a blind eye even when it's hard for you to hear what I say. However, we all need to expose the lie that is being pushed on countries such as ours, with leaders who are blindfoldedly willing to buy into any rhetoric that is being pitched by West, without even simply asking the question, hey, did you guys do the same when you were an emerging economy? As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, these economic theories pushed on us are not geared to solve our issues and make our nation wealthy. Instead, it allows us to be bigger beggars, while countries that are dictating this nonsense thrives. Well, joining me now via Zoom from Amsterdam in the Netherlands is distinguished research fellow at the University College London, Professor Steve Keen. Professor Keen is also the author of Debunking Economics, a must-read for all of you who wants to know the truth about this BS being pushed on countries like Sri Lanka. Thank you very much, Professor, for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me. Now, the IMF for 17 times has been talking about balancing the budget deficit. But we see that in countries like the US itself, they have a huge budget deficit. So what are they hiding from us, Professor? And what are we doing wrong when we are being told that the most important thing is to balance the budget?
Well, Mahesh, you made the point that most countries have had a deficit. And if you look at, for example, at America, America's average deficit for the last 120 years is 2.5% of GDP. Even if you take the wars out, when there's enormous government spending, of course, during First and Second World War, it's 1.7% of GDP. So the standard situation for most countries is to run a deficit on the government spending. And the reason that is actually functional, works, it's part of why American economies has succeeded, is because that actually creates money. When the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it's putting more money to people's bank accounts than it's taking out of their bank accounts. So the money supply grows, and that enables domestic activity to expand. Now, your real danger is that expansion of the money supply can go into one of two things, either inflation, which governments are always trying to control, or it can go into imports. And therefore, the benefit of your expanding money supply is to expand somebody else's economy and not yours. So conventional economists get this wrong by, frankly, not understanding money. This might sound crazy because people think economists must be experts on money because economics is about money. But conventional economists convince themselves that money is irrelevant. They leave money out of their model. They talk about the money illusion and say you shouldn't consider the actual amount of money, and that problem gets in the way. So their advice to you is not to do what their economies have done empirically, but to do what their theory says is right. And in fact, their theory is wrong. What you should be trying to focus upon is your trade deficit, not your government deficit.
Indeed, it makes a lot of sense. Now, Professor, there are many failed economic theories worldwide that Western governments are pushing on countries like Sri Lanka, especially the neoliberal economic theory is currently infesting our nation. Clearly, it won't bring the results we expect. So for a country like Sri Lanka, how should we think about our economy and what should we be doing right now?
Well, again, I think the most important thing is that you obviously need to develop your infrastructure, develop your technological capabilities and industries and so on. And the biggest danger you face, this is a common danger for third world countries, is that you end up importing large amounts of foreign goods in that process and you're in a trade deficit. And I believe the trade deficit is the main issue you need to focus upon. Now, what you therefore say, well, how do we reduce the trade deficit? Well, part of it could be, for example, in controls on imports. Now, that's the last thing conventional economists are going to agree to. So what happens is there is a potential mechanism. You say the real danger is your trade deficit, which is why you have to borrow foreign money, and then you've got to repay foreign money with export income, which means you therefore have to put more input into exports and less into domestic production and so on. All these things end up crimping your capacity to build your own industrial capacity over time. And when economists who actually look at the empirical data, people like Danny Roddick, who's a good mainstream economist, Roddick has looked at it and said most countries which succeeded in industrializing, like South Korea and Japan and even Germany, did it by protecting their economies initially, using trade barriers to ensure that their money creation went to domestic rather than international suppliers, and then put pressure on those suppliers to become internationally competitive over time. So that gave them very efficient industries. So things like Samsung evolved out of that sort of policy in South Korea. That's what you should be doing, but economists will not even contemplate anything that might control the trade deficit, and they're anti-import controls and so on. Those are the things I think you should be actually considering, the things economists won't let you do.
Absolutely. Now, Professor, austerity is another financial strategy implemented in Sri Lanka, saying that it will help us overcome our current predicament. Does it work?
No, austerity is a stupid policy. In fact, the best country to see how bad austerity is the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom has been practicing austerity really for the last 15 years. And over that 15 years, the rate of growth of the UK has been below that of virtually every other country in the OECD and certainly every other country in Europe. So what austerity does is say that what austerity translates to for the economy is let's create less government money. And so with less government money, people are more likely to borrow from the private sector. So you're going to have an increase in private debt. You will get speculative bubbles coming out of that. You won't get much real investment occurring. And there's less money in turnover, so people are less likely to be able to invest out of working capital. So you actually end up crippling your capacity to grow over time. And as I said, austerity is saying the government should run a surplus. That means the government should take money out of circulation. How is the economy supposed to grow when you're reducing the amount of money? So austerity is a stupid policy. The only country that's followed it consistently in Europe is the one that's performed the worst. And when you take a look at the relationship between the scale of government deficit and the rate of economic growth, the correlation is positive, the higher up to a certain point. But certainly you want to run a deficit to enable the private sector to have the money to do ordinary commerce and to enable people to invest out of cash flow rather than having to borrow from the financial sector when they're more likely to end up speculating on asset prices with that money than actually investing. So austerity is a bad policy informed by bad theory.
Indeed, a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much. I really appreciate, Professor, you speaking to us. That was Distinguished Research Fellow at the University College London, Professor Steve King. Let's take a short commercial break. This is the State of the Nation. Back in a moment. Welcome back, everyone. This is the State of the Nation. Now, last week we discussed how free trade agreements could help Sri Lanka look towards a better business environment and opportunities. However, those FTAs should be drawn according to better ways of making our economy work, not be a slave to another nation. Now, one key free trade agreement that's in discussion is with China. This FTA will cover trade in goods, services, investment, and economic and technological cooperation. Joining me now from Beijing, China, via Zoom is Sri Lanka's ambassador to China, Dr. Palitha Kohana. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your time. Good to see you once again. Now, Ambassador, what is the current situation of the FTA between China and Sri Lanka?
Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you again, Manish. We've had some very interesting discussions in the past. The free trade agreement, yes, the free trade agreement is back on the table. The two sides, China and Sri Lanka, are discussing the details. Of course, we have to remember that the economy of Sri Lanka is substantially different from the economy of China. China is the second biggest economy in the world, and some people say that it will become the first largest economy within the next decade or so. So when Sri Lanka is negotiating with such a big economic power, it has to ensure that certain safeguards are incorporated into an agreement. This is what we industries, our agriculture is safeguarded. And I'm certain that the Chinese side understands this because we are not two equals negotiating to conclude a free trade agreement. We are substantially different in our size, in the range of goods that we produce and export, etc. So there are so many things to be resolved at this stage, but I'm very confident that this can be done. The President of Sri Lanka, Ranil Wickremesinghe, has said clearly that he intends to have this agreement concluded this year, hopefully sooner than later. The Chinese side has also been pushing us hard. There is considerable goodwill. So I'm certain, I'm confident that we will be able to have an agreement very soon. It's also something that we need to remember that many of the other countries in our region and outside who have concluded free trade agreements with China have benefited immensely. Their exports to China have increased exponentially. China is the biggest consumer market in the world. There are so many things that we can export to China if only there were an agreement of this nature between the two sides, whether it's our agricultural products, marine products, our garments, our fisheries products. There are so many things that we can export to China. but we need the framework of an agreement of this nature to be in place for that to happen.
Indeed. Now, Ambassador, China has been opting towards a more silent stance regarding Sri Lanka's affairs recently, especially regarding the economic crisis. Is China now considering Sri Lanka to be an unreliable friend?
I think that's a very unfair question that you're asking me. And here I am sitting in Beijing responding to that question. No, I don't think so. On the other hand, China has constantly been our friend and supported us in many ways. China has consistently supported us at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and in many other ways. When we needed vaccines last year, at a time when the COVID epidemic was spinning out of control or threatening to spin out of control in Sri Lanka, it was China that came up with 26 million doses of vaccine, 3 of which were gifted to Sri Lanka at a time when other countries, other manufacturing countries, either could not or would not give us the vaccines. So it's very unfair to say that Sri Lanka is not being considered as the close friend it was with China. I think and then very importantly, recently China listed 20 countries to which Chinese travelers could go to on a pilot basis. And Sri Lanka was in that group of 20. And you know, the Chinese are just bursting. They're waiting to get out and travel. And for Sri Lanka to be put into that category of 20 is a major achievement. It's a reflection of the closeness of our relationship, the strength of the bonds between the two countries, and of course, with thousands of Chinese travelers coming to Sri Lanka, it would make a huge difference to our efforts to recover from the financial crisis that we are in at the moment. The embassy is working very hard on this issue, and in fact, on the 28th, have a major promotion of Sri Lanka with over 100 Chinese travel agents and media people attending an event at the embassy. So I think that it's very important to remember that the strength of the relationship is still the same. There may be detractors who will say otherwise, but rest assured, China remains a close friend and a very strong ally.
Absolutely. We have to leave it at that. That was Dr. Palitha Kohona, Sri Lankan Ambassador to the People's Republic of China. Thank you very much, sir. Let's take a short commercial break. This is a State of the Nation. Back in a moment with the closing. Looking at the faces of people I meet, like my family, the staff here at Derana, and even any random bystander on the road, we see a sense of utter frustration. But this frustration is unfortunately not being reflected by the leaders of this country. Take a look at our parliament. It's a joke. Here I am preaching to the whole country to come together. And the key argument going around in parliament, the lawmakers' chambers, is whether or not we need an election. Unfortunately, at this crucial point, they can't come together to bring this nation out of chaos. For what point does this election serve? Are we going to keep an election for the sake of keeping one at this crucial point? To give power to another group of representatives with their own personal agendas at heart and not the people's? The bigger question is whether this election can really change the course of this country. When we keep digging, we find that this chaos is also part of a story cooked up by the very puppet masters who managed to pull out one of the best regime changes in recent history with no consequences to them. On the other hand, look at Vladimir Putin and Russia's mission to do a regime change in Ukraine and how that's affecting and costing them. Speaking of which, Elon Musk tweeted something quite important and relevant to our country about the Lord and Savior of Colombo liberals, Mama Newland. In reference to a tweet by Dr. Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk says, there is no one more interested in pushing the Ukraine war than Victoria Nuland. I know many Sri Lankans who still fail to see the United States' role in a war manufactured by them that can put the whole world back a few decades. I mean, if you need evidence, look at Sri Lanka. The war in Ukraine was a nudge they needed to get us into this crisis mode where we are right now, and thereby scattering ourselves to accept anything they give, saying it's the solution. A very close friend of mine always tells me to be happy with what you got. That statement, to be happy with what you got, never sits right with me. Because if I was ever happy with what I got, then I would have never pushed myself to be the best version of myself on a daily basis. It's the very same lesson I can share with all of you in this country. We certainly cannot be happy with what we got. We have to push ourselves out of this misery and make sure that our situation is better than it was yesterday for us and the best for our children. I remember this little quote taught to me by my literature teacher back in school. She told us to memorize the saying and live by it, and that's exactly what I have done, and I will leave it with you tonight. My literature teacher used to say, good, better, best. Never let it rest till your good is better and your better is best. Words I live by to date. It's time to wake up, Sri Lanka. My call to you tonight is to wake up to what's happening around you. The world is not going to wait till we get our act together. So we better do it sooner rather than later. On a programming note, make sure you listen to our podcast, which is released weekly. This week, our focus is on liberal economics and the upcoming local government elections. Do check us out, the State of the Nation podcast, available on Apple Podcast and Spotify. I'm Mahesh Johnny from all of us at Derana 24. Have a good night and a productive week. I'll see you back again next Saturday on Get Real and for sure on Sunday on State of the Nation. Good night.